Arizona Territory, 1885. The unforgiving sun beat down on the parched earth like a hammer on anvil, marking the third year of a drought that had transformed the once promising rangeland into a wasteland of cracked soil and withered hopes. Dust devils danced across the barren plains, mocking the desperate prayers of ranchers and farmers who watched helplessly as their livestock grew thinner and their futures dimmer. Ethan Ashford believed the frontier had taught him all it needed to. Trust no one, depend on no one, and never put down roots. At 25, his lean frame already bore the weathered look of a man who'd seen too much. His hands were calloused from years of hard work, his blue eyes guarded beneath the brim of his dust-covered hat. The frontier was no place for softness or sentiment, he'd learned. Only grit and lonely determination kept a man alive out here. "You heading out at first light?" The livery owner's question broke through Ethan's thoughts as he checked the cinch on his saddle. "Yes, sir, no point in staying where there's nothing left." Ethan's voice was quiet but firm. His employer's ranch had finally succumbed to the drought, the last of the cattle sold off for a pittance. Now, like so many others, Ethan was drifting again. "Heard they're needing hands up near Flagstaff," the older man offered, "not hit quite so hard by the dry spell." Ethan nodded, though the prospect brought him little comfort. Another ranch, another temporary bed, another place he'd eventually leave behind. This was the pattern of his life, movement without destination, work without purpose. Sometimes he told himself it was freedom, but in the hollow quiet of night he recognized it for what it was. Fear dressed up as independence. As a boy, he'd watched his father pour everything into a homestead only to lose it all: land, hope, and finally his will to live, when the rains failed to come 3 years running. His mother had followed soon after, her heart simply giving out one winter night. Since then, Ethan had vowed never to be vulnerable to such loss again. Better to own nothing, love nothing, be nothing but a hired gun and a strong back. Dawn broke pale and hot over the eastern horizon as Ethan rode out of the small town of Redemption. His bay gelding kicked up small clouds of dust with each step, the only other living thing sharing his journey. He carried little, some jerky, coffee, ammunition for his colt, a change of clothes, all the possessions a drifting cowboy needed. The less you had, the less you could lose. 30 miles north, in the struggling settlement of Promise Springs, Abigail Foster stood on the porch of her father's general store and watched another family load their wagon to leave. At 22, with honey-brown hair that fell in waves to the middle of her back and eyes the color of summer sage, Abigail had become accustomed to saying goodbyes. The drought had thinned the town's population month by month, each departure another wound to the community she loved. "That's the Hendersons gone," her father said, coming to stand beside her. James Foster's face showed the strain of keeping a store open in a dying town. "Said they're heading to California." Abigail nodded, smoothing the front of her simple blue cotton dress. "Mrs. Henderson promised to write when they're settled." "They all promise that," her father said with a gentle smile that didn't reach his tired eyes. "You should consider going too, Abby. Your aunt in St. Louis would welcome you." "And leave you." "Leave Promise Springs," she shook her head firmly. "This is home, Papa, the rain will come again." Her father sighed but didn't argue. They'd had this conversation too many times before. Instead, he returned inside to tend to the dwindling inventory and the rare customer. Abigail remained on the porch, her gaze moving over the dusty main street with its boarded-up windows and sagging signs. Unlike so many others, she refused to abandon hope. Where others saw only desolation, she still saw possibility. This stubborn faith had earned her both admiration and pity from the townsfolk who remained. What none of them knew was how deliberate her optimism had become, a daily choice, a resistance against despair. After losing her mother to consumption 3 years prior, Abigail had watched her father nearly crumble under the weight of grief. Her cheerfulness had been a lifeline for him then, and now, with their livelihood threatened by the drought, she clung to it with even greater determination. She believed in kindness as survival, that generosity in hard times was not foolishness but strength. When hungry families couldn't pay their bills, she slipped extra items into their parcels. When children's clothes wore thin, she stayed up nights mending and sewing. Her gentle heart had become the town's hidden reservoir in a time of drought. But even Abigail's deep well of hope was beginning to run dry, though she'd never admit it aloud. Each night she prayed for rain, for prosperity to return, for some miracle that would save Promise Springs from becoming yet another ghost town in the territory. What she never prayed for was love. That dream she had carefully packed away, like the wedding dress her mother had sewn for her, now stored in cedar with lavender sprigs. There were no eligible men left in Promise Springs, and practical concerns had long since overshadowed romantic ones. Life had become about endurance, not happiness, until the afternoon a dust-covered cowboy rode into town, leading a limping horse and looking like he hadn't seen water in days. Ethan had pushed too hard across the unforgiving terrain. The spring that had been marked on his outdated map had dried to nothing but a muddy depression in the earth, and his canteen had run empty by noon. The sun had beaten down mercilessly, and his bay gelding had stepped into a prairie dog hole, wrenching its leg badly. They'd been forced to a slow walk for miles, with Ethan leading the horse to spare its injury. By the time the scattered buildings of Promise Springs appeared on the horizon, both man and beast were near collapse from thirst and heat. Ethan's throat felt like sandpaper, his lips cracked and bleeding. The bay's head hung low, each step clearly painful. Abigail was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the store, fighting a losing battle against the ever-present dust, when she spotted the approaching figure. Shading her eyes, she could make out a man walking beside a horse, both moving with the slow deliberation of exhaustion. "Papa," she called, leaning into the store. "Someone's coming." Her father joined her, squinting into the distance. "Poor soul looks half dead," he observed. "Better fetch some water." By the time Ethan reached the edge of town, Abigail was waiting with a dipper and bucket of well water. She wore no hat, and the afternoon sun caught golden highlights in her brown hair that momentarily distracted Ethan from his thirst. "You look like you could use this," she said, offering the dipper without preamble. Too parched to speak, Ethan took the water with a nod of thanks. He drank deeply, then took a second dipperful and let his horse drink from his cupped hands before taking more for himself. "Thank you, ma'am," he finally managed, his voice rough. Map showed a spring that wasn't there anymore. "Most aren't," she replied, "not for 2 years now." Her green eyes studied him with frank concern. "Your horse is injured." It wasn't a question, but Ethan nodded anyway. "Prairie dog hole, nothing broken, I think, but he needs rest. We have a stable behind the store. It's not much, but there's shade and water." She turned to lead the way, then paused, looking back over her shoulder. "I'm Abigail Foster." "Ethan Ashford," he offered, suddenly conscious of his dust-covered clothes and unshaven face. "Don't want to impose." She smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed her face from pretty to beautiful. "Mr. Ashford, in times like these, helping isn't an imposition, it's how we all survive." The simple statement caught him off guard. In his experience, frontier kindness came with expectations of repayment or reciprocity. But something in her direct gaze suggested no calculation, just a straightforward decency he'd encountered too rarely in his wanderings. "Much obliged, Miss Foster," he replied, following her down the main street. Abigail led him to a small stable where her father kept their delivery wagon and an elderly mule named Bartholomew. The building was solid but simple, with a trough of clean water and a small store of precious hay. "You can put your horse here," she said. "I'll fetch our neighbor Mr. Wilson, he knows about horse ailments." "I can pay," Ethan said quickly, reaching for the thin wallet in his vest pocket. Abigail waved away the gesture. "Let's worry about that after we know what your horse needs." While they waited for Mr. Wilson, Abigail brought Ethan a plate of cold cornbread and dried apple slices from the store. He ate slowly, conscious of her watching him with curiosity. "You're heading north?" she asked, settling on a hay bale opposite him. Ethan nodded. "Heard there might be work near Flagstaff." "Everyone's heading somewhere else these days," she said with a hint of sadness. "Promise Springs is mostly promises and not much spring anymore." Despite his exhaustion, Ethan found himself studying her more closely. Unlike many women he'd encountered in frontier towns, Abigail Foster seemed neither hardened by circumstance nor diminished by it. There was a quiet strength in her posture, a thoughtful intelligence in her eyes that spoke of resilience rather than mere endurance. "Why stay?" he asked before he could stop himself. If she was offended by the blunt question, she didn't show it. Instead, she considered it seriously, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "This is home," she said simply, "and someone has to believe it has a future, or it certainly won't." Before Ethan could respond, an elderly man with a shock of white hair appeared in the stable doorway. Mr. Wilson, as it turned out, had been a cavalry farrier in his younger days. He examined Ethan's bay with practiced hands, clicking his tongue and muttering to himself. "Strained tendon," he finally pronounced. "Not the worst I've seen, but he won't be carrying you anywhere for at least 2 weeks, maybe 3. Rest, cold compresses, and this liniment I make." He reached into his pocket and produced a small tin. "Apply morning and night." Ethan felt a sinking in his gut. 2 weeks meant depleting what little money he had on room and board, leaving nothing for the journey ahead. As if reading his thoughts, Abigail spoke up. "We have a room above the store," she said, "simple but clean, and we could use help with deliveries and heavy lifting while you're here." She glanced at her father, who had joined them midway through the examination. James Foster nodded agreement. "Our regular delivery boy left with his family last month. Been trying to manage on my own, but these old bones protest." Ethan hesitated. Staying in one place meant forming connections, however temporary. Connections meant complications. Yet he had little choice with his horse injured, and the practical arrangement they offered would preserve his dwindling funds. "I accept," he said finally, "and I'm grateful." That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread in the Fosters' small apartment behind the store, Ethan found himself on their back porch with James, smoking a rare cigarette offered by his host. The night was cool, a blessed relief after the punishing heat of day. "Abigail says you're a drifting man," James observed, exhaling a stream of smoke. "Yes, sir, work where I can find it." "No family waiting somewhere?" Ethan shook his head. "No, sir, no one." James studied him thoughtfully. "That's a lonely way to live." "It's simpler," Ethan countered. "No attachments, no disappointments." The older man chuckled. "That sounds like a philosophy born of hard experience." "You could say that." Ethan's tone discouraged further questions, and James respected the boundary. From inside came the soft sounds of Abigail washing dishes, occasionally humming a tune Ethan didn't recognize. The domesticity of it struck him as foreign, almost from another world than the one he inhabited. "My daughter believes in this town," James said after a companionable silence. "More than that, she believes in people. Always has, even after seeing plenty of evidence to the contrary." "That's rare," Ethan acknowledged. "Rare and sometimes worrisome for a father," James admitted. "The world isn't always kind to those with gentle hearts." He tapped ash from his cigarette. "But she was right about you, I think." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Sir." "She said you had honest eyes," James said with a small smile. "Said we could trust you." The statement left Ethan uncomfortable. He wasn't accustomed to being trusted on sight, nor to the responsibility such trust implied. He'd spent years perfecting his ability to remain detached, passing through people's lives without leaving a mark or carrying away a memory. "I'll work hard while I'm here," was all he could think to say. "I know you will, son," James replied. "I know you will." That night, lying on the narrow bed in the small room above the store, Ethan listened to the unfamiliar sounds of Promise Springs, the distant bark of a dog, the creak of the windmill that still turned hopefully despite the dry well beneath it, the soft stirring of what breeze managed to find its way through his open window. For the first time in years, he fell asleep in a place that wasn't a bunkhouse shared with other cowboys or a bedroll under the stars. Morning came with the rich aroma of coffee drifting up from below. Ethan dressed quickly and descended the back stairs that led to the Fosters' living quarters. Abigail was already at the stove, her hair neatly braided and pinned, wearing a simple dress of faded green calico with a clean white apron. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," she greeted him cheerfully. I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in some time, thank you," he admitted, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. "And please call me Ethan." "Ethan," she repeated with a smile. "Then you must call me Abigail, or Abby as most do." "Abigail suits you better," he said without thinking, then felt a flush of embarrassment at the personal observation. If she found the comment forward, she didn't show it. "My mother thought so too. She said Abby sounded like a little girl's name, and I've been grown since 16. A shadow briefly crossed her face at the mention of her mother, but she recovered quickly. "Breakfast is simple, just biscuits and gravy. We save bacon for Sundays." The meal was indeed simple but delicious, the biscuits light and the gravy seasoned perfectly. Ethan ate with appreciation, realizing he couldn't remember the last time he'd had a home-cooked breakfast served at a proper table. After breakfast, James outlined Ethan's duties. The store received weekly deliveries from the nearest railroad station 20 miles away, and local orders needed to be assembled and delivered to those customers too elderly or infirm to come into town. There was also maintenance to be done, shelves to be repaired, a leak in the storeroom roof to be patched, heavy inventory to be moved. "Without the horse, you'll need to use the wagon and old Bartholomew," James explained. "He's slow but steady." The work was straightforward enough, and Ethan applied himself with the thoroughness that had made him a valuable hand on ranches across the territory. By midday, he had reorganized the storeroom, repaired 3 shelves, and delivered 2 orders to elderly residents on the edge of town. It was during these deliveries that Ethan began to understand what Abigail had meant about helping others to survive. At each home she had included small extras, a jar of preserves, fresh baked goods, or mended clothing, items not on their orders and, he suspected, not charged to their accounts. The recipients accepted these additions with a mixture of gratitude and dignity that spoke of a community accustomed to looking after its own. When he returned to the store, Ethan found Abigail helping a young mother whose child was fussing irritably in the heat. "I've only got enough for the flour, Miss Foster," the woman was saying apologetically, counting out coins. "The medicine will have to wait until next week when Thomas gets paid." "Nonsense, Mrs. Reed," Abigail replied firmly. "The little one needs that fever tonic now. We'll put it on account." "But Mr. Foster said no more credit," the woman protested weakly. "Then consider it a loan between friends," Abigail insisted, already wrapping the medicine bottle. "Sarah needs to get better, and you need peace of mind." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Abigail said, pressing the package into her hands. "Now go home and take care of that little one." After the woman left, Ethan approached the counter. "Your father know about that?" he asked quietly. Abigail glanced up, a flicker of defiance in her green eyes. "He pretends not to." "It's our arrangement." "Seems like a quick way to go out of business, giving away stock." "We're not giving it away," she corrected. "We're investing in our neighbors. When times improve, they remember who stood by them." She began straightening items on the counter. "Besides, what good is surviving if we lose our humanity in the process?" The question lingered with Ethan throughout the day and into the evening, as he tended to his horse, applying Mr. Wilson's pungent liniment to the strained tendon. He found himself contemplating Abigail Foster's worldview. It contradicted everything the frontier had taught him about self-preservation and the folly of attachment. Yet there was something compelling about her certainty, her unwavering belief in the value of connection even, perhaps especially, in times of hardship. It challenged his carefully constructed defenses in a way that both unsettled and intrigued him. Days passed into a week, and Ethan fell into the rhythm of life in Promise Springs. Each morning began with breakfast in the Foster kitchen, followed by work in the store or deliveries around town. In the evenings, he checked on his horse's progress and helped with whatever tasks needed doing before sharing a simple supper with Abigail and her father. It was a routine both foreign and oddly comfortable, like a coat that shouldn't fit but somehow did. Despite his intentions to remain detached, Ethan found himself drawn into the small community's struggles and occasional joys. a successful well deepening that yielded a trickle of precious water, a birth celebrated despite the uncertain future, a wedding hastily arranged before the groom departed to find work in California. Through it all, Abigail moved with grace and purpose, her kindness neither showy nor self-conscious but as natural as breathing. She seemed to know everyone's troubles and strengths, offering exactly what was needed: practical help, quiet encouragement, or simply a moment of normalcy in hard times. Ethan found his gaze following her more often than he cared to admit, noting the way sunlight caught in her hair when she stepped outside, or how her face transformed when she genuinely smiled. He told himself it was merely appreciation for someone so different from himself, curiosity about a perspective so contrary to his own. 10 days after his arrival, disaster struck. A fire broke out in the livery stable at the end of the main street, spreading quickly in the dry conditions. The town's bucket brigade formed immediately, but with the well running low, they fought a losing battle against the flames. Ethan joined the effort without hesitation, passing buckets and helping to evacuate horses from the burning structure. The heat was intense, the smoke choking, but he worked alongside men he'd come to know by name, determined to save what they could of the town's precious resources. It was during this chaos that he spotted Abigail rushing toward the burning building, her skirts gathered in her hands. "The Perkins boy," someone shouted. He was sleeping in the hayloft. Before Ethan could process the words, Abigail had disappeared into the stable, heedless of the flames licking at the doorway. Without thinking, he dropped the bucket he was holding and ran after her, ignoring shouts of warning from behind him. Inside, the smoke was blinding, the heat a physical force against his skin. He could hear the terrified whinnying of horses still trapped in their stalls, the crackle of burning wood, and then faintly Abigail's voice calling a name. "Tommy, Tommy, where are you?" Ethan followed the sound, crouching low where the air was marginally clearer. He found her at the base of a ladder leading to the hayloft, preparing to climb. "Abigail," he shouted above the roar of the fire, "get out of here." She turned, her face streaked with soot, eyes desperate. "There's a child up there." "I'll get him," Ethan said, grabbing her arm. "Go." For a moment she hesitated, then nodded and turned toward the door. Ethan didn't wait to see if she made it out. He scrambled up the ladder, which was already beginning to smolder. The loft was a hellscape of smoke and sparks, the hay providing perfect fuel for the hungry flames. "Tommy," he called, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. "Tommy Perkins." A small whimper from the far corner drew his attention. Crawling on his hands and knees, Ethan made his way toward the sound until his hand touched a small boot. The boy, no more than 7, was curled into a tight ball, face buried in his arms. "I've got you, son," Ethan said, gathering the child into his arms. "Hold on tight." The return journey was a nightmare. The ladder was now fully ablaze, forcing Ethan to seek another way down. He spotted a stack of hay bales near a window at the back of the loft and made his way toward it, the boy clinging to his neck. Outside, he could hear voices shouting, the continued splash of water against the burning building. The window was small, but it would have to do. Ethan broke the glass with his elbow, clearing the jagged edges as best he could. "We're going to jump," he told the boy. "It's not far and there's hay below. Can you be brave?" The child nodded mutely against his shoulder. Ethan climbed onto the window ledge, gauging the distance to the ground. It was about 12 feet, not ideal but survivable. He clutched Tommy tightly and leaped. The impact drove the breath from his lungs, but the pile of discarded hay broke their fall enough to prevent serious injury. Ethan struggled to his feet, the boy still in his arms, and staggered away from the burning building just as the roof collapsed behind them. "Tommy!" A woman's cry cut through the chaos as Ethan emerged into the town square. "Mrs. Perkins ran toward them, face streaked with tears and terror. Ethan handed the boy to his mother, who clutched him with desperate relief. "Thank God," she sobbed. "Thank God and you, sir." Ethan barely heard her gratitude. His eyes were scanning the crowd frantically for Abigail, fear clutching at his chest with cold fingers. When he finally spotted her helping to organize the bucket line, relief washed over him with such force that his knees nearly buckled. She saw him at the same moment and ran to him, propriety forgotten as she threw her arms around him in a fierce embrace. "You found him," she whispered against his soot-covered shirt. "Thank heaven you found him." The feel of her in his arms, warm and alive and trembling with relief, broke something open in Ethan's chest, something he'd kept locked away for years. He held her tightly, his face briefly buried in her hair, breathing in the scent of her beneath the smoke and fear. "Don't ever do that again," he said roughly when he finally released her. "Running into a burning building, what were you thinking?" "The same thing you were," she replied, her eyes meeting his steadily, "that a child's life was worth the risk." The fire claimed the livery stable and damaged 2 adjacent buildings before it was finally extinguished. Miraculously, no lives were lost, human or animal, though several people suffered burns and smoke inhalation. The town doctor, an elderly man named Patterson, treated the injured in the street, his limited supplies stretched to their limit. Ethan escaped with minor burns on his hands and a persistent cough that brought up black phlegm. Abigail insisted on treating his injuries herself, applying salve to his reddened skin with gentle fingers. "You could have died," she said quietly as they sat on the back porch of the store, away from the continued activity in the town square. "So could you," he countered, wincing slightly as she wrapped a clean bandage around his right hand. "It would have been worth it to save Tommy." "No," the word came out more forcefully than he intended. "No life is worth yours, Abigail." She looked up, surprise evident in her expression. "That's not for you to decide, Ethan." "Isn't it?" he asked, suddenly unable to maintain the distance he'd so carefully cultivated. "If something had happened to you," he couldn't finish the thought. Abigail's hands stilled on his bandage, her eyes searching his face. Whatever she saw there made her breath catch audibly. "Why would it matter to you?" she asked softly. "You're leaving as soon as your horse is sound." The reminder of his imminent departure struck Ethan like a physical blow. His horse was healing well. Within days, he would have no reason to remain in Promise Springs. The realization brought an unexpected ache. "I know," he said, looking away from the question in her eyes. "But that doesn't mean I want to see you hurt." The moment stretched between them, taut with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Abigail finished bandaging his hand and rose to her feet. "We should get some rest," she said. "Tomorrow we'll be busy with the cleanup." Ethan nodded, grateful for the reprieve yet strangely disappointed. As he climbed the stairs to his room above the store, he was uncomfortably aware that something had shifted inside him, a crack in the fortress he'd built around his heart. For the first time in years, Ethan Ashford was afraid, not of physical danger or material loss, but of the pain that came with caring too deeply. The frontier had taught him that attachment was vulnerability, and vulnerability led to suffering. Yet in the space of 2 short weeks, Abigail Foster had made him question this fundamental belief. The cleanup after the fire brought the remaining residents of Promise Springs together in a display of community spirit that impressed even Ethan's cynical heart. Buildings were cleared of debris, salvageable materials set aside for rebuilding, and those displaced were taken in by neighbors without hesitation. Working alongside men and women he now knew by name, Ethan found himself drawn further into the town's struggle to survive. Their determination in the face of both drought and fire spoke of a resilience he'd underestimated, a strength born not of individual grit but of collective support. Abigail was everywhere during these efforts, organizing relief, comforting those who had lost property, and somehow maintaining the store's operation simultaneously. Ethan watched her move through the crisis with a steady grace that belied her youth, her optimism not blind faith but a deliberate choice renewed each day. 2 weeks after his arrival in Promise Springs, Ethan's horse was pronounced fit to travel. Mr. Wilson removed the bandages and nodded with satisfaction as the bay put weight on the formerly injured leg without hesitation. "Good as new," the old man declared. "You've got a strong animal there, Mr. Ashford. Take care of him and he'll take care of you." Ethan thanked him, slipping an extra coin into the man's hand despite his protests. The news should have brought relief, the open road beckoning, the promise of work in Flagstaff, the return to the unfettered life he'd chosen. Instead, he felt a growing unease, a reluctance he couldn't quite name. That evening, he found James Foster alone in the store after closing, recording the day's meager sales in a leather-bound ledger. "Mr. Wilson says my horse is ready to travel," Ethan said, leaning against the counter. James looked up, his pen poised mid-entry. "So you'll be leaving us then?" It wasn't a question, but Ethan answered anyway. "I suppose so. I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." The older man set down his pen and regarded Ethan thoughtfully. "It hasn't been an imposition. You've been a godsend these past 2 weeks, especially with the fire." He closed the ledger with deliberate care. "We could use a man like you permanently, you know. The store needs a strong back, and there's talk of rebuilding the livery. They'll need experienced hands." The offer caught Ethan off guard. "I'm not much for settling down, Mr. Foster." "So my daughter mentioned." James smiled faintly. "She says you're determined to keep moving, though she can't quite understand why." The mention of Abigail sent an uncomfortable prickle down Ethan's spine. "Did she ask you to make this offer?" "Abigail, good Lord, no," James chuckled. "She'd be mortified if she knew I was suggesting it. No, this is purely selfish on my part. I'm not getting any younger, and this place is too much for one man." His expression grew more serious. "And while I'd never presume to guess your feelings, I'm not blind to how you look at my daughter." Heat rose in Ethan's face. "Sir, I haven't." James held up a hand. "No need for protestations, son. I'm not accusing you of anything improper, just making an observation," he sighed. "Abigail has had offers before. Even in these hard times, a girl with her qualities doesn't go unnoticed. But she's never shown interest in any young man until you rode into town." The revelation sent Ethan's thoughts spinning. Had he misread her kindness as simply part of her nature rather than something specific to him? "I don't have anything to offer her," he said finally, the words coming from a place of raw honesty he rarely accessed. "No land, no prospects, nothing but a saddle and a horse." "Perhaps," James agreed. "But you have qualities that matter more: courage, honor, a willingness to risk yourself for others. I saw that during the fire." He stepped out from behind the counter, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Just think about it. That's all I'm asking." After James retired for the night, Ethan found himself restless, his mind churning with conflicting impulses. He slipped out of the store and walked down Promise Springs Main Street, the night air cool against his face. The town was quiet, most windows dark save for the occasional lamplight. The burned skeleton of the livery stood as a stark reminder of how quickly security could vanish, yet also of how people could come together in crisis. Ethan stopped before the charred remains, remembering the fear that had gripped him when he realized Abigail had run into the flames, not for herself, but for a child who needed help. That was the core of who she was, he realized. Not merely kind, but brave in her kindness, willing to risk everything for what she believed was right. It was a courage different from the physical bravery he'd cultivated, deeper, more sustaining. "Couldn't sleep." Ethan turned to find Abigail approaching, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the night chill. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the moonlight in a way that made his breath catch. "Just thinking," he replied. She came to stand beside him, both of them facing the burned building. "About leaving tomorrow." "So she knew, of course she did." "Yes." Abigail nodded, her profile calm in the dim light. "Flagstaff is beautiful this time of year, they say. Less affected by the drought." "That's what I heard," he hesitated. "Your father offered me a permanent position here." She turned to him then, surprise evident in her expression. "He did?" "Said the store needs a strong back, and the livery will need rebuilding." "And what did you say?" Her voice was carefully neutral, but Ethan detected an underlying tension. "I said I wasn't much for settling down." "I see." She looked away, back toward the burned building. "That's consistent with what you've told me about yourself." The disappointment in her tone, however controlled, cut deeper than Ethan expected. An impulse to explain himself, to make her understand, rose unexpectedly. "My father was a settler," he said abruptly. "Had a homestead in Nebraska when I was a boy, put everything he had into that land, his money, his hopes, his heart. Then the drought came 3 years running, just like here. He swallowed hard. I watched it destroy him piece by piece. The day we lost the last of the cattle, something broke in him. He started drinking, then gambling what little we had left. Within a year we lost the land. Within 2, I lost both my parents. Abigail's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers warm against his. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. That's when I learned what the frontier really teaches," he continued, the words spilling out now that the dam had broken. "Don't put down roots, don't tie yourself to anything or anyone. Stay free, stay moving, and you can't be broken by loss." "And has it worked?" she asked softly. "This strategy of yours, has it brought you happiness?" The question hung in the night air between them, simple yet devastating in its insight. Had detachment protected him from pain or merely prevented joy? "It's kept me alive," he said finally. "Is that enough?" Her green eyes searched his face in the moonlight, not challenging but genuinely curious. Ethan had no answer for her. For years, survival had seemed sufficient justification for his choices. Now, standing beside this woman who embodied everything he denied himself, connection, commitment, the courage to care despite the risk, he was no longer certain. "I don't know," he admitted. Abigail squeezed his hand gently before releasing it. "Well, you have until morning to decide. Whatever choice you make, I hope it brings you peace." She stepped back, preparing to leave. "Good night, Ethan." "Abigail," he called as she turned away. She paused, looking back. The words he wanted to say caught in his throat, too many, too complicated for this moment. Instead, he simply said, "Thank you." "For everything." She smiled, a hint of sadness in the curve of her lips. "You're welcome for everything." Ethan watched her walk away, her figure receding into the darkness. The emptiness that followed her departure felt like a premonition of what awaited him on the road ahead, solitude that had once seemed like freedom now revealing itself as something closer to exile. He remained by the burned livery long into the night, weighing choices that suddenly seemed to matter more than any he had faced before. Dawn broke with an unexpected sound, the soft patter of raindrops on the tin roof above Ethan's room. He woke instantly, disoriented by the unfamiliar noise until recognition dawned. Rain. After months of drought, rain was falling on Promise Springs. He dressed quickly and descended the stairs to find the store already bustling with activity. James Foster stood at the door, watching the steadily increasing downpour with a look of wonder on his weathered face. "Would you look at that?" he said as Ethan approached. "Been praying for this sight for 2 years." Outside, people were emerging from their homes, standing in the rain with upturned faces and outstretched hands, laughing and weeping in equal measure. Children danced in the growing puddles, their parents making no move to call them inside despite the soaking they were receiving. "Is Abigail?" Ethan began, but James pointed down the street. There she was, standing in the middle of the road, face lifted to the sky, her dress already plastered to her slender form by the falling water. Her hair hung in wet ropes down her back, but her smile was radiant, visible even from a distance. Without conscious decision, Ethan stepped off the porch and walked toward her, heedless of the rain that immediately drenched his clothing. She saw him coming and turned to face him, her expression a mixture of joy and something more complex. "It's a sign," she called over the sound of the downpour. "The drought is breaking." "Maybe," he agreed, stopping before her. Water ran down his face into his eyes, but he couldn't look away from her. "But one rain doesn't end a drought." "No," she admitted, "but it's a beginning. That's all we ever needed, just a beginning." The double meaning in her words was unmistakable. Ethan reached out, brushing wet strands of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "I haven't packed my saddlebags yet," he said quietly. Hope flared in her eyes, quickly tempered by caution. "Does that mean you're staying?" "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I just know I'm not ready to leave." "Not today." Her smile returned, brilliant as sunrise. "Then today is enough. Tomorrow will take care of itself." Around them, the celebration continued as the rain fell steadily, soaking the parched earth and filling empty barrels placed strategically throughout the town. It wasn't a deluge, but a gentle, persistent shower, exactly what the land needed to begin healing. In that moment, standing in the rain with Abigail Foster, Ethan felt something shift inside him. A crack in the fortress, yes, but also the first tentative stirrings of something new taking root. It terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. "We should get out of the rain," he said eventually, conscious of how long they'd been standing there, how many eyes might be watching. Abigail nodded but made no move to leave. "Ethan," she said softly, "whatever you decide, I want you to know these weeks have mattered. You've mattered." The simple declaration stripped away his final defenses. Without overthinking, he bent and pressed his lips gently to hers, a brief, chaste kiss that nonetheless sent warmth coursing through him despite the cool rain. When he pulled back, her eyes were wide with surprise, her lips slightly parted. For a moment he feared he'd overstepped, but then she smiled, a private expression meant only for him. "We should definitely get out of the rain," she agreed, a new warmth in her voice. Together they walked back toward the store, neither touching nor speaking, yet somehow changed by what had passed between them. The rain continued to fall, washing away dust and despair, leaving possibility in its wake. One day became two, then a week, then a month. The rains continued intermittently, never enough to cause flooding but sufficient to bring tentative green back to the landscape. The change in Promise Springs was palpable, not just in the physical environment, but in the renewed energy of its inhabitants. Ethan remained, working alongside James in the store and helping with the rebuilding of the livery stable. He sent a letter to his contact in Flagstaff, explaining his change of plans, and received a reply that the position had been filled, news that brought unexpected relief rather than regret. His relationship with Abigail developed slowly, deliberately. They walked together in the evenings, talking of books she had read and places he had seen. On Sundays, he accompanied the Fosters to the small church where the congregation now offered prayers of thanksgiving rather than desperate pleas for rain. Occasionally, when James was occupied elsewhere, Ethan would steal a kiss in the storeroom or hold her hand beneath the counter, each small intimacy precious in its newness. "You've ruined me, you know," he told her one evening as they sat on the back porch, watching lightning flicker on the distant horizon, promising more rain. "Have I?" she asked, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder. "Completely," he smiled into her hair. "I used to be able to pack my entire life in a saddlebag at a moment's notice. Now I find myself thinking about furniture and roof repairs." She laughed softly, the horror. "Next you'll be considering a vegetable garden." "Don't push it," he warned, but there was no edge to his tone. In truth, the transformation in his thinking had been gradual but profound. The very attachments he had once feared now anchored him, giving purpose to each day beyond mere survival. He still woke sometimes in the night, heart racing with the old anxiety that everything could be lost in an instant. But increasingly, those moments were balanced by a new understanding, that a life protected from potential loss was also a life denied potential joy. Abigail had shown him a different kind of courage, not the stoic endurance he'd practiced for years, but the bravery to remain vulnerable despite knowing the risks. To choose connection over isolation, hope over cynicism, love over fear. 2 months after the rain began, Ethan asked James Foster for permission to court his daughter formally. The older man had smiled, clasped his hand, and said simply, "About time." That evening he took Abigail for a walk beyond the edge of town, to a small rise where wildflowers had begun to reclaim the land, tiny yellow blooms spreading like stars across the recovering earth. "It's beautiful," she breathed, kneeling to touch the delicate petals. "I'd forgotten how quickly the desert can transform when given a chance." "I spoke with your father today," Ethan said, watching her rather than the flowers. She looked up, her expression curious. "About what?" "About us." He knelt beside her, taking her hands in his. "Abigail, I came to Promise Springs believing the frontier had taught me all I needed to know about survival. I was wrong. You taught me what really matters, that enduring isn't the same as living, that safety isn't worth the cost of solitude." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. "And what does that mean, Ethan Ashford?" It means I'm staying, not just for now, but for good, if you'll have me." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a simple gold band, purchased with savings he'd once intended for emergencies on the trail. "I know I don't have much to offer yet, but I'm working on that. What I do have is a promise to build a life with you, here in this town that you never stopped believing in." Tears spilled onto her cheeks now, but she was laughing through them. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am," he confirmed, suddenly nervous despite the joy in her expression. "Rather badly, it seems." "No," she said, shaking her head, "you're asking perfectly." She extended her left hand, fingers trembling slightly. "And yes, Ethan, yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the emotion he'd once been too afraid to feel, let alone express. She responded with equal fervor, her arms twining around his neck as they knelt among the wildflowers, the setting sun casting them in gold. When they finally broke apart, breathless and laughing, Ethan pressed his forehead to hers. "I love you, Abigail Foster. I think I have since you offered me water when I was dying of thirst." "And I love you," she replied, "since you ran into a burning building to save a child, proving that beneath all that careful detachment beat a heart braver and more generous than you wanted to admit." They were married that autumn, when the rains had transformed Promise Springs into a community reborn. The small church overflowed with well-wishers, many of whom had returned to town as news of the breaking drought spread across the territory. Abigail wore her mother's wedding dress, altered by her own skilled hands, with wildflowers in her hair. Ethan, in a new suit that still felt stiff and unfamiliar, watched her walk down the aisle with wonder that such happiness could be his. The following spring, they moved into a small house on the edge of town, built with the help of neighbors on land that James had purchased years earlier as an investment. Ethan continued working at the store, but also took on the management of the rebuilt livery stable, combining his knowledge of horses with his growing business acumen. Promise Springs grew steadily as the rains established a more regular pattern. New families arrived, drawn by reports of fertile land and a resilient community. The general store expanded, then added a post office. James Foster, with more help than he'd had in years, found time to court and eventually marry the widowed schoolteacher who had arrived the previous winter. Through it all, Ethan and Abigail built their life together one day at a time, planting a garden, adding rooms to their small house, welcoming their first child, a daughter with her mother's green eyes and her father's determined chin. On the night their daughter was born, Ethan stood on the porch of their home, cradling the tiny bundle while Abigail finally rested inside. The moon was full, illuminating the landscape that had transformed from desolation to abundance in the years since he had first ridden into town. "I had it all wrong," he whispered to his sleeping daughter. "The real lesson of the frontier isn't how to survive alone, it's that we need each other to truly live." The baby stirred, tiny fingers curling around his calloused thumb with surprising strength. In that grasp, Ethan felt the final pieces of his old fear dissolve, replaced by a fierce protective love that encompassed his daughter, his wife, the life they had created together. He had come to Promise Springs running from the pain of attachment, convinced that the frontier rewarded only independence and stoic solitude. Instead, he had found the truth, that even in the harshest landscapes, it was connection that sustained, kindness that healed, and love that transformed mere survival into a life worth living. The drought had broken in the land and in his heart, and in its place had bloomed something he had never dared to hope for: a home, a family, a future rooted in the very soil he had once been so determined to leave behind. As if sensing his thoughts, his daughter opened her eyes, regarding him with a gaze both ancient and new. Ethan smiled down at her, this miraculous evidence of what could grow when fear gave way to hope. "Welcome to the world, little one," he said softly. "There may be hard times ahead, that's the nature of life out here, but you'll never face them alone, that's a promise." Inside, Abigail called his name, her voice tired but happy. Ethan turned toward the sound, toward the warmth and light of the home they had built together, carrying their daughter over the threshold and into the waiting arms of love.